We just observed and participated in this Passover service, symbolizing that the death penalty has been paid for us. And we, of course, have just observed the days of unleavened bread and celebrated these days because of the grace that we have received as a result of that sacrifice of Christ. Grace is something we do not deserve, and we definitely cannot earn on our own. In John chapter 1, verse 17, John 1:17, it says, "For the law was given through Moses, but grace came through Jesus Christ." The Greek word for grace is interesting. It means kindness, favor, and also beauty. And favor, it can be translated as favor, but pleasant and precious. That's the Old Testament definition of grace. The New Testament, again, is acceptable, a favor, a gift, and a pleasure. And of course, those old timers would remember Mr. Armstrong used to define grace as unmerited or undeserved pardon. It's pardon or the forgiveness that we didn't deserve. Once in the state of grace, it is possible to lose that state of grace. And there are several requirements for remaining in the state of grace throughout our life. And today we'll mainly take a look at one. If you go to Proverbs chapter 3, verse 34, Proverbs 3, verse 34, and it says, "Surely he scorns the scornful, but gives grace to the humble." So one of the requirements for remaining in a state of grace is having humility. And the New International Version says that he mocks the proud, where New King James says he scorns the scornful, but New International says that God mocks the proud, but gives grace to the humble. This is especially important to us today, considering the state and the condition of the world that we're living in at this time, and then also the condition and state of the end-time church. The greater church today is in rather sad condition. If we go back to Revelation chapter 3, of course, we're all familiar with Revelation chapter 3 and the description of the end-time church. It says, beginning in verse 14, Revelation 3, "And to the angel of the church of the Laodiceans write, these things says the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. I know your works, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were cold or hot." The idea here, the attitude of some right now is, hey, we've got plenty of time. There's still some out there saying, oh, we've got 20 or 30 years left. And we're not being persecuted, which is true, so at this time, so there's no need to set up a big alarm if we're not being persecuted, right? Just sit back, relax, and send in your tithes to do the work, And then, of course, some have even said, well, God has blessed us with the COVID vax, so get your shots and send in your money. Verse 16, "So then, because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will vomit you out of my mouth. Because you say, I am rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing, you do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked." The church here is described as deceiving themselves and lacking in humility. And as a result, the church is blind and very poor spiritually. Continuing in verse 18, "I counsel you to buy me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich, and white garments, that you may be clothed, that your shame of your nakedness may not be revealed, and anoint your eyes with eye salve, that you may see. As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten, therefore be zealous and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him, and he with me. To him who overcomes, I will grant to sit with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." One would hope that everyone in the church today, as we see our society and our whole world collapsing around us as a result of sin, would be seriously considering this letter to the Laodiceans and what it says and where it may apply to us. Verse 22, of course, says that we to hear what the Spirit says to all 7 of the churches. However, this is the dominant attitude at the end of this age and at the time that we are in now. And we all need to seriously look at Laodicea and ask God to show us which of these qualities or characteristics may apply to us personally. Laodicea is from 2 Greek words that can mean let the people judge or judgment of the people. And it is actually a judgmental church. In verse 17, it says, because you say I am rich, the Greek really means abounding, and have become wealthy. And this would be more in the sense of, hey, I have great understanding. I have the right calendar. I understand who Yahweh is and how we ought to pronounce his name. Continuing on in the verse, and have need of nothing. Hey, I know my Bible. I'm in great standing with God. And I will be in the place of safety, no sweat. And do not know that you are wretched, miserable, and poor. And the Greek for poor literally means a cringing beggar. That is the state of being poor, is a cringing beggar. Blind can range anything from smoky to totally blind. It can be a whole range of, let's say, disability of the eyesight or of the sight. And of course, naked would be lacking godly righteousness. So Laodicea is especially lacking in humility, and it is that pride that has Laodicea blinded and deceived. There is so much division in the church today because so many have the idea that I am right and I'm proud of it. I have the right calendar and you don't, or I've held on to everything exactly as it was taught in 1986 and you haven't. Shortly before his death, when Jesus was revealing end-time events, he also told us more of the condition of the end-time church in Matthew 25. Matthew 25, beginning in verse 1. Matthew 25, 1. It says, then the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Now 5 of them were wise and 5 were foolish. The Greek for wise can also mean thoughtful and discreet and practical. And the Greek for foolish can mean dull, stupid, heedless, or blockhead. That's what the word actually means. And indeed, we can be dulled by the cares of this world. If they are heedless, it means that people are not watching or listening, and they are ignoring what is going on in the world around them. Verse 3, those who were foolish took their lamps and took no oil with them, but the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. But while the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept. And at midnight a cry was heard, behold, the bridegroom is coming, go out to meet him. Then all those virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the wise answered, saying, no, lest there should not be enough for us and you, but go rather to those who sell and buy for yourselves. And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding, and the door was shut. And this parable is for the church, for us, at the end of this age, those of us living now. Back in Psalms chapter 111, verse 10, Psalm 111, verse 10, it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and a good understanding have all those who do his commandments. His praise endures forever. And evidently, a lot of that godly fear is lacking at the end of the age with the end-time church. And of course, as Laodicea, they're not wearing white garments, they're naked. Over in Romans chapter 1, beginning at verse 18, Romans 1:18, it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." And truth is, now we're at an age and at a time that, never been like it, I don't think, for truth being suppressed in this world. And truth is being suppressed even by some in the church. The idea that we can't correct error in the church's teachings from the 80s because somebody may not like it, or it could affect our income. And truth is being expressed sometimes by church leaders that know better than what they're even teaching. Verse 19, "Because what may be known of God is manifest in him, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened." That's a very loaded verse. I just recently saw there are some in the World Economic Forum that now totally deny God and that say that they openly brag about that they are taking the place of God in deciding the future or the destiny or where man ought to be and deciding what is right for us. In verse 21 there where it says, "And they knew God," it means they were aware of God, perceived, they understood God, and that they did not glorify him as God. Or glorify basically is to esteem, to honor, or to magnify God as God. Neither were they thankful, and it basically is grateful. And today the American people, the whole Western civilization, has become a very ungrateful people for what they have, and are losing the wealth and freedom as a result of that ingratitude. And sadly, how many in the church have had that pearl of great price and let it go that we've known over the years? And like Laodicea's attitude is definitely one of ingratitude. Continuing in verse 21 there, it says, "But then they became futile in their thoughts." And futile, the Greek also means foolish, wicked, or idolatrous. It includes all of those, and become totally vain, and by implication, unintelligent, or literally foolish, unintelligent. And it says, "Professing to be wise, they became fools." And again, here wise is being clear, having a clear understanding or a clear knowledge. They became fools. Here it's literally simpleton, dull, or flat. And the same word here is also translated, they lose savor. And in Matthew 5:13, if you remember, it says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor," or the Old King James says, "lost its savor," it is the same word as fool. If you become a fool, "how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot of men." So it is entirely possible for people that were converted and were wise to lose that wisdom and become foolish. How does this happen? And how did the church get into this condition? So let's go back to where it all started in Isaiah 14. Isaiah 14, beginning in verse 12. Isaiah 14:12. It says, "How are you fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, or Hallel, the day star, son of the morning? How are you cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations? For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, I will also sit on the mountain of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Here, pride and arrogance totally took over his reasoning, and he deceived himself into thinking that he could be equal to his Creator. Continuing on in Ezekiel chapter 28, more about, as we know, the fall of Satan. Ezekiel 28, and beginning in verse 11, it says, Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation for the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God, you were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. So he was created and was full of wisdom. We'll drop down to verse 15. He says, You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created till iniquity was found in you. By the abundance of your trading you became filled with violence within, and you sinned. Therefore I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the fiery stones. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. Here it was pride corrupted his wisdom, and he became foolish. Pride distorted and corrupted his thinking, and the pride blinded him with his true abilities. In Psalm 36, verses 1 and 2, Psalm 36, verses 1 and 2, reading it first from the New International Version, it says, An oracle is within my heart concerning the sinfulness of the wicked. There is no fear of God before their eyes, for in his own eyes he flatters himself too much to detect or hate his sin. The New Living Translation says, Sin whispers to the wicked deep within their hearts. They have no fear of God at all. In their blind conceit, they cannot see how wicked they really are. And here again, pride blinds. Pride blinds people pride can blind us all to sin. Ecclesiastes 2:14, the first part of this verse, it says, The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And we see that pride leads to foolishness, which leads to darkness. Humility can lead to wisdom, which is light, leads to light or to understanding. In Psalm 136, verse 6, Psalm 136, verse 6, it says, Though the Lord is on high, yet he regards the lowly, but the proud he knows from afar. The NLT says, Though the Lord is great, he cares for the humble, but he keeps his distance from the proud. He keeps the proud at a distance. And Proverbs chapter 11, verse 2, just one verse, Proverbs 11:2, it says, When pride comes, then comes shame, but with the humble is wisdom. We have seen so far that the end-time church era, that Laodicea has a problem with pride. Satan corrupted or lost his wisdom as a result of his pride. He became foolish. Pride blinds and makes one foolish. And the parable of the 10 virgins in the end-time church tells us, unfortunately, that half of the church is in this state of foolishness. Pride and foolishness go hand in hand. Humility and wisdom go hand in hand. That is why it is so important that we seek humility and seek wisdom. There's an event prophesied in Zephaniah. You can turn to Zephaniah chapter 2. There's an event here prophesied for the end-time church that we're all praying happens very soon. And there are instructions here, and they have conditions that we generally don't particularly look at. Zephaniah chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Gather yourselves together, yes, gather together, O undesirable nation, before the decree is issued, or the day passes like chaff, before the Lord's fierce anger comes upon you, before the day of the Lord's anger come upon you." As we know, this is the gathering together of the humble and the wise in the church, in the end-time church. And the next verse describes the qualities and conditions required to be among this group. Verse 3, it says, "Seek the Lord, all you meek of the earth, you who have upheld," or the Hebrew literally means to practice his justice, those that practice his justice. "Seek righteousness." The New King James says humility. The King James says seek meekness. "It may be that you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger." He is speaking here to the meek of the earth who have upheld God's justice. The protection is for those who, number one, seek the Lord, that seek righteousness, and seek meekness or humility. That's where this protection is offered to. Most of the newer translations of the Bible say, "Seek the Lord, all you humble of the earth," rather than meek of the earth. And even the New King James says, "Seek humility," rather than seek meekness in the second part of the verse. Meekness and humility are not the same and are not totally interchangeable. The translators have done a disservice in interchanging these words in the newer translations. The Old King James Version seems to be more accurate in the actual translating of meekness and humility, or meek and humble. And possibly this happened because of what meekness is implied to mean today, which isn't exactly the biblical definition of meekness. But humility and meekness have distinct and separate meanings, and we can find that in Colossians chapter 3. We have an example in the New Testament where both are used in the same verse, that they are not, the exact same, have the exact same meaning. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 12, it says, "Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bear with one another, forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, you must also do." Humility here, the Greek it's a humiliation of the mind, or modesty, and it's basically thinking of yourself in a low degree, or lowly, or low estate. Meekness just has more the meaning of mildness, by implication it's humility, but it is mildness. It is basically gentleness with an element of humility. Meekness would be gentleness with an element of humility. Now, looked up the word humble and meek in the various dictionaries. Humble here in Merriam-Webster says, "Not proud or haughty, not arrogant or assertive. One is reflecting, expressing, or offered in a spirit of difference or submission, like a humble apology. Ranking low in a hierarchy or scale, insignificant, unpretentious." The Cambridge Dictionary says, "Not proud or not believing that you are important, poor or of a low social rank, ordinary, not special or very important." So it's not considering, it's one's attitude of oneself, basically. Macmillan says, "Not proud and not thinking that you are better than other people." So humility is really how we view ourselves. Meek, the Cambridge says, "Quiet, gentle, and not willing to argue or express your opinions in a forceful way." Well, the Bible doesn't totally agree with that when it comes to meek, as we'll get into. But Merriam-Webster says, "Enduring injury with patience and without resentment." Mild. And it says, "Deficient in spirit or courage, submissive, not violent or strong, but moderate. The Macmillan says, quiet, gentle, and easily persuaded by others to do what they want. So our modern definition of meekness is more being weak and without courage. And biblically, meekness is not weakness. It's not being weak. Back in Zephaniah 2, again, it's the gentleness of mind when it's about being meek, meek being a requirement. It's gentleness of mind, and with the element of humility. So we could say humility is having a realistic view of ourselves in relation to or comparison with God. Humility is knowing how insignificant we are and not feeling that we are special or important. And it's the opposite, of course, of being proud. Meekness involves our view and how we interact with other people. Meekness is being humbly patient with people and dealing with gentleness, love, patience, and respect. It is basically loving our neighbors as ourselves, and basically agape love. It's where agape love comes in. This would be meekness. In Psalm chapter 25, verses 8 and 9, Psalm 25, verses 8 and 9, it says, good and upright is the Lord, therefore will he teach sinners in the way. The meek he will guide in judgment, and the meek he will teach his way. So again, here it is the meek that God is working with. In James chapter 3, beginning in verse 13, James 3, beginning in verse 13, it says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. So here James ties wisdom and meekness together, and he proceeds to give examples of the absence of meekness here. He says, verse 14, but if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. And we find this really evident in the intellects of this world today, of being self-seeking. There's lots of confusion and being sensual, earthly and sensual. Verse 16, for where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are. And our world is definitely full of that. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. And verse 17 defines wisdom and meekness. Meekness totally has to do with our loving our neighbor as ourselves. Verse 18, now when the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. If there was a lot more humility and meekness in this world or in the church, there would be a lot more peace. Let's look at some examples of humility and meekness of individuals that definitely were not weak. And we'll go back to Numbers chapter 12, verse 3. Numbers 12, verse 3. It says, now the man Moses was very meek above all men which are upon the face of the earth. That's in the King James. And if he was meek, he definitely was not weak, as we'll see. Let's go to Exodus chapter 3. We'll begin in verse 1. We'll look at some of the qualities of Moses here. Exodus chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. It says, now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of the bush. So he looked, and behold, and the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, but the bush, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near to this place. Take off the sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to a place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I also have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Moses was raised by Pharaoh's daughter. He was raised in the court of the Pharaohs. According to Josephus, he was a mighty general in Egypt that had conquered, and was well known in the government. He didn't say, hey, I'm just the man for this job with all the experience I've had in Egypt, and being a general and being in Pharaoh's court. And his humility was a big factor in him being chosen to lead the Israelites out. We'll now go over to Exodus 32, beginning in verse 1. Exodus 32, beginning in verse 1. It says, Now when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, Come, make us a god that shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And Aaron said to them, Break off the golden earrings which are in your ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. And they said, This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. So when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. Then they rose early the next day, offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Then the Lord said to Moses, Go get down, for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molded calf and worshipped it, sacrificed to it, and said, This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and I will make of you a great nation. Then Moses pleaded with the Lord his God and said, Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak and say, He brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath and relent of this harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have spoken of I give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. So the Lord relented from the harm which he would do to his people. Moses here was very meek, yet very strong in speaking to God here, and having that concern for the people and for God. In verse 10, God offered to make the descendants of Moses, make his descendants fulfill the promise to Abraham that it would all be through Moses, and he wouldn't have it. And he did have a concern here for both what the people would say of God, if he wiped out the people, what the Egyptians and what just the reputation that they had, and of course for the people of Israel themselves. So here, and we know from Moses' entire history, there was nothing weak about Moses in any of his actions or doings in leading the people. There's an example then in 1 Samuel chapter 17. We have an example of pride and arrogance versus humility and wisdom with David. 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning in verse 1. 1 Samuel 17:1, it says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle and were gathered at Sukkah, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Sukkah and Ezekiel." Verse 2, "And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, 'Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. And if he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us.' And the Philistine said, 'I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together.'" Here, Goliath was a very proud, arrogant, and foolish man. Verse 11, "When Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons, and the man was old, advanced in years, in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone out to follow Saul into battle." We'll drop down to verse 14. "David was youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening." So they had been going at it here they've been going for over a month. "Then Jesse said to his son David, 'Take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captains of their thousands, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them.' Now Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with his keeper, and took the things, and went as Jesse commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up a battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came to and greeted his brothers. Then he talked with them. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel." Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, "What shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away this reproach from Israel. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, why did you come down here, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. We have big brother here getting on his little brother's case here. Verse 29, and David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing, and these people answered him as the first ones did. Now when the word which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go up against this Philistine with him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. And it would sound a little bit arrogant could sound a little arrogant on David's part for making this offer. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came, and I took a lamb out of the flock. I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. When it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he defied the armies of the living God. David wasn't offering to do this because he thought he personally was so great, but rather was his intent here was to serve God in the process. Verse 37, it says, moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. So David here was giving God the credit. He wasn't taking that credit for himself, but he was giving God the credit, basically in humility. And I'll just interject here. You don't have to turn here. Proverbs 28, verse 1. The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion. In the part, the righteous are bold as a lion. That was Proverbs 28, 1. And this was kind of his case here. So we'll continue in verse 38. So Saul clothed David with his armor and put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. And David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. David knew his limitations, and he had faith in God protecting him, that he didn't need the armor that was working against him anyway. Verse 40, then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistines. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the men who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you came to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Again here, very boastful, very proud, and he thought he was unbeatable. Verse 46, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcass of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Again, he kept giving God the credit. He wasn't taking credit for himself here. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So it was when the Philistine arose and came near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward him, toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out the stone, and he slung it, and struck the Philistine in the forehead so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of the sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell among the road to Saraim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. So here, David did come out of this, and again, was giving God the credit. We'll continue in chapter 18, verse 17 of 1 Samuel. Now, one of the promises, if you remember, was that if anybody killed Goliath, that the king would give him his daughter to wed. So in 1 Samuel 18, verse 17, it says, Then Saul said to David, Here is my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battle. And we'll continue in verse 18. So David said to Saul, Who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel that I should be son-in-law to the king? Again, David wasn't playing politics here, and yet he was being chosen to be the king's son-in-law. He was, he was very humble in realizing his position, and that he did not deserve to be the son-in-law of the king. We know that David made some big mistakes in his life, but the Psalms that he wrote clearly revealed that he maintained his humility and his meekness all his life. We'll continue on here now then in Matthew chapter 11. Matthew 11, another example of meekness, verse 28, Matthew 11, 28. Jesus is speaking here, and he says, Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle. That's New King James. The King James says, I am meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. We all know that Jesus set the example of total selflessness and a total concern for mankind, and he definitely was not weak. He was meek, but not weak. In the four Gospels, when Jesus was speaking, he referred to himself as the Son of Man 84 times. Out of the 24 times that the Son of God is recorded in the Gospels, all but 5 times are when other people were calling him the Son of God. He never basically bragged about being the Son of God, so to speak, or always had a humble approach. He presented himself with humility and gave God the credit and the glory. Those 5 times when he did, it was basically admitting that he was the Son of God, not that he was bragging about being the Son of God. Now in John chapter 2, beginning in verse 13, John chapter 2, beginning in verse 13, this is at the beginning of his ministry. It says, Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business. When he had made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise. Again, he wasn't a weak individual that would publicly do that in the temple. He upset a lot of people here, and he wasn't afraid to go in and clean house. He did it to honor God and for the good of everyone, and not to make a name for himself. Verse 17 of John 2, it says, Then his disciples remembered that it was written, Zeal for your house has eaten me up. Again, he was meek, but he wasn't weak. And we know, of course, that Jesus set the example of the foot washing that we were all supposed to follow, and that is all about humility and meekness. It is serving the brethren or washing the brethren's feet. In Luke chapter 4, Luke 4 verse 16, it says, So he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up. Again, this is the beginning of his ministry. As his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. When he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written, The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. He's quoting Isaiah 61 verse 1 here. And in the King James, the word translated poor is really is translated as meek, that to preach the gospel to the meek. And the Hebrew, again, means the state of mind, and it's not referring to one's financial condition or financial state. It means humble, meek, and lowly. We have Paul as an example. If we go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning in verse 15, it says, For though you have 10,000 instructors in Christ, yet have you not many fathers, for in Christ Jesus I have begotten you through the gospel. Wherefore I beseech you, be you followers of me. For this cause I have sent unto you Timothy, who is my beloved son, and faithful in the Lord, who shall bring you into remembrance of my ways which be in Christ, as I teach everywhere in every church. Now some are puffed up as though I would not come to you, but I will come to you shortly, if the Lord will, and will know not the speech of them which are puffed up, but of power. For the kingdom of God is not in word, but in power. What shall I come unto you with a rod, or in love, and in a spirit of meekness? That's King James Version. And most of the newer translations say in a spirit of gentleness. But again, the Greek means gentleness with humility or meekness. And his desire was to come to them in meekness and humility, and not have to come with a rod or get tough with them. Meekness is a requirement for the first fruits for ruling with Christ. At the beginning of the millennium, we'll be dealing with a broken group of people. They certainly don't need someone beating on them with a rod. Some of the survivors will have lived a lifestyle we may find disgusting at that time, and yet we will still have to deal with them in meekness when that time comes. Paul gave the Corinthians instruction in meekness and is an example of different situations for us today. If you'll turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians 10, beginning in verse 23. Paul writes here, he says, All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. So here's meekness in action. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no question for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. If any of those who do not believe invites you to dinner and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no questions for conscience sake, It's not speaking here of unclean meats, because as we know, it's speaking of clean meats that had been offered to an idol. But if anyone says to you, this was offered to an idol, do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you, and for the conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other, for why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? Therefore, whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense neither to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. This was all about having concern for the spiritual state and development of other people that may have been newer in the church or just did not have the deeper understanding that some of those had. And we need to accommodate the newer or weaker person without being offensive to them or causing them to stumble. That there are things, in this case, the eating of the meat wasn't breaking the law of God, but yet it would have been offensive to some of the individuals in the church. And Paul says, don't do it. This is meekness in action. We may have differences of opinions in different matters, and being in someone's face over a difference of opinion is not an attitude of meekness. There may be situations occasionally that we need to be in someone's face over doctrinal matters, and that's only if a meek approach doesn't work. But not in no matters of opinion, especially, that we need to be we may be right, we may even be right, but we don't want to be offensive or offending the others, and have we need that attitude of meekness. In Romans chapter 12, verse 10, it says, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another. So it's an example, again, of meekness, giving preference to one another. Drop down to verse 16. It says, be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. Again, we just participated in the Passover service, and the act of foot washing, which we participated in, is an act of humility and an act of meekness on both parts, on both sides. We ate the Passover bread, which of course symbolizes the body of Christ, the broken body of Christ, but it also, that body of Christ is the church. It represents the whole church. And we need meekness and humility in dealing with the greater church. Matthew 5:5, you don't have to turn there, but the verse we're all familiar with in the Sermon on the Mount, it says, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And meekness is a requirement, but it has a very big blessing that goes with it. Psalm 37:11, basically is what's being quoted here. You don't have to turn there either, but Psalm 37, verse 11, it says, but the meek shall inherit the earth and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace. And there is definitely a peace that comes with meekness and with humility. Now, in Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5, Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5, it says, do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like him. Verse 4, verse 5 is, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. It takes a combination of wisdom and meekness to know when to respond and when to be silent. We've experienced the last 2 years that all the COVID hype has some people scared silly, and when I say silly, I mean stupid. They are scared, literally scared stupid. When there's no reasoning with someone, it is best just to be silent in dealing with these people. There are other situations that require a wise response or correction that's given in humility and in meekness, maybe to burst their bubble, but there is a time to be silent and there is a time to respond. It's a matter of having the wisdom to know when to do which, and the meekness and humility in how we do that. 1 Peter chapter 5, 1 Peter 5, verse 5. First Peter 5:5, it says, "Likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another." Or basically practice meekness is what he's saying. "And be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." Again, we are to be clothed with humility. And again, we just celebrated the days of unleavened bread, which are all about the celebration of God's grace. And humility is one of the requirements, again, for remaining in this state of grace. Verse 6 says, "Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time." It is definitely a lot more pleasant to work on humbling ourselves than to have God take some drastic action on us and humble us. I had a couple of years ago, I was it was a motorcycle race, a quarter-mile track race, and there was an individual that was winning this race by quite a margin. And as he was coming across the finish line, he decided to do a wheelie. Only he pulled it up a little bit too high, and he, at about 60 miles an hour, started flipping over backwards as the winner. This is the winner crossing the finish line. He was showing off, and he wasn't hurt, but his bike was in pieces that he ended up picking up off the track. And it's always reminded me that it's better we humble ourselves than to have some situation humble us, because it was a little embarrassing to say the least for him. Verse 7, it says, "Casting all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." And now at the end of this age, we need especially be on guard on deceptive teachings. We are in a world that has gone totally crazy with ever-increasing evil inspired by Satan. And we are seeing more and more how people in high and scholarly and scientific positions have given themselves totally over to evil and to Satan. And we do need to be very vigilant and watchful. And it's to the point, too, we have no idea what to believe in the news, what can be believed and what's true and what isn't. Verse 9, "Resist him steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world." All the brethren in the church around this world are living and dealing with the same insanity that we are here, and we need to pull together and hold on. We have read Christ's own words of the condition that the church would be in at the end-time church, that half of the church would be wise and half would be foolish. We have seen the description of Laodicea, a church full of pride that is deceived and blind. And each of us has a responsibility for our own spiritual condition, and each of us contribute to the overall condition of the church, of the greater church. So we all need to keep that in mind. I'll turn here to Proverbs 15, verse 33. You don't have to turn there, but Proverbs 15:33. It says, "The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility." That was the New King James. And and I think it's the NLT. It says, the reverent and worshipful fear the Lord. Fear of the Lord brings instruction in wisdom, and humility comes before honor. So again, we all need to be drawing closer to God than ever before and growing in this humility. Remember that there is a direct correlation between pride and foolishness and between humility and wisdom. And humility and wisdom develop together and work together. We are living in a time that is as in the days of Noah. It's end time that we are in. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, it says, Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent and thoughts of his heart were only evil continually. Until the last 2 years, it's been hard to grasp that the thought or the idea that the intents of the heart was only evil continually. We now have the wealthy and powerful blatantly boasting their evil and their evil intent. They're no longer covering it up. We need to be very careful navigating in this world today. We need humility and wisdom to survive. We need meekness in dealing with others, and that will become more and more of a challenge as we have more in-your-face people and more corruption and wickedness around us, that dealing with some people could be a real challenge in maintaining a meek and humble attitude, or a meek attitude. Matthew 10, verse 16, a verse that was primarily to his disciples, but it applies to us. Matthew 10:16, he says, Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And that's what we all need to be striving for, to be harmless and yet to be very wise in our dealings with others, to be meek but not weak. We are very close to the end and hoping for God's protection from the tribulation and, of course, and from the day of the Lord. So remember those instructions again in Zephaniah, that for those that will be protected, or those that gather together. And you don't turn there, but I'll just repeat Zephaniah 2, verse 3. It says, Seek the Lord, all you meek of the earth, who have upheld his justice. Seek righteousness, seek humility. It may be that you will be hidden in the days of the Lord's anger. And we all need to be striving and seeking for that humility and meekness. Humility in how we see ourselves, and meekness in how we see and interact with others. And of course, meekness is loving our neighbor as ourselves. For a final verse here, again, you don't have to turn here, but Psalm 149, verse 4. Psalm 149, verse 4. It says, For the Lord takes pleasure in his people. He will beautify the meek with salvation. We have that promise of salvation. Zephaniah speaks of humility and meekness gaining us protection for the 3.5 years. But it is what that lies beyond that that should be our goal, arriving at that beauty of salvation. That is what we all need to be humbly and meekly striving for, is that beauty of salvation.